Well, it's that time of year when it's the joy of unwrapping gifts, and we all know what it's like to pick up a box that has our name on it and begin to peel back the pieces of paper, and slowly we begin to see exactly what it was that we had been anticipating. Of course, for some of you, when you were kids, you probably snuck into your parents' room and looked ahead of time to see what it was they had gotten you. So it wasn't a big surprise. I would have never done that, but I'm sure some of you did. In a sense, when we continue down the Gospel of Mark, you can almost think of it as pulling back the pieces of paper. And so that inch by inch, chapter by chapter, we begin to get a clearer view of who Jesus is. We're going to see a little bit more of his nature, of his purposes, of his character. And so that the farther we go, the more we discover the real Jesus, not just the historical Jesus, but the Jesus who is loving, compassionate, and who is King. And we come to chapter 3 this morning, and again, Mark is sort of fast-paced, moving forward, and some have looked at chapter 1 and said these are authority stories, meaning that they show something, all the scenes in chapter 1 show something about Jesus' authority. And you get to chapter 2, and people have called those the conflict stories because Jesus immediately is coming into conflict with the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes of the Pharisees, and you see the wisdom of his grace against worldly thinking. And then when we come to chapter 3, something changes a little bit. There's still conflict, there's still authority being demonstrated, but now Jesus is really building his kingdom. He's moving ahead, and we see how Jesus is really putting together a new community of people who are going to embody the kingdom of God. And the narrative just continues to pick up, and we see this through his teaching and through his healing and through how he counsels people and liberates people and preaches. And you have to remember that Mark is a gospel more of actions than it is words. Mark records less of what Jesus says and more of what he does. And so it's our job as we go through to read these stories and say, where do I fit in? Where do I fit in? So Mark chapter 3, we're going to read verses 7 through 19, and there's primarily two groups here. There are the crowds, and there are the called. There's the large crowds who are following Jesus, who are wanting to touch Jesus, and then there are those whom Jesus has called to himself. Where do you fit in? Verse 7, chapter 3. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and from beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. And he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him. For he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around him to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried, "You are the Son of God." And he strictly ordered them not to make him known. And he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again, so they could not even eat. The text really divides naturally into two sections. We have verses 7 through 12. 7 through 12, Jesus is by the lakeside. This is where he's met by the crowds. And then verses 13 through 19, he's on a mountaintop. And instead of a throng of people, Jesus draws to himself 12 that he deliberately, specifically called to himself. The contrast between the crowd and the called is something for us to take note of. And so we just take one at a time. You have Jesus by the lakeside with the crowd. Verse 7, Jesus appears really to be at the height of his popularity. He's a polarizing figure. So if you were here last week and Shannon preached on the verses right before this, it ended with the Pharisees and the Herodians conspiring together to kill Jesus. Now, these are an unlikely group of people to come together. They didn't like each other, and yet they're trying to figure out how to get rid of Jesus. And it's really ironic when you think about it. The Pharisees devoted their entire lives to keeping the law, how to interpret it, how to live by the letter of the law of Moses, rule by rule, regulation by regulation. And now they're deliberately trying to commit murder. But the reason why they had to plot was because they wanted to do it legally, or at least as legally as possible. And so you can only conclude that they got to that point because they didn't realize how much they needed the grace of God. You see, when we have a wrong view of God, and inevitably it leads to a skewed view of ourselves, a mistaken view of our sin. And when we fail to see the infinite holiness of God, we see little of our own self-centeredness, of our own depravity, and our own need of grace. Because when a person becomes enthralled in the true nature of God, who he really is in his majesty, in his holiness, in his wonder, in his perfections, the thought of earning his favor by keeping rules is the farthest thing from your mind. Isaiah the prophet said, we've all become like one who is unclean, and all of our righteous deeds are like polluted garments. You realize what he's saying there. He's not just saying your sin is horrible, your sin is awful. He's saying, no, even the best things that you do, your greatest deeds, your most righteous actions are still like dirty garments. I mean, no wonder Isaiah, perhaps the holiest man of his time, said that he too was a man of unclean lips. He recognized that he was a man who needed the cleansing power of God to pardon him and cleanse him from his sin. And so the Pharisees were confident in their own righteousness. I mean, they're trusting in what they had done or what they hadn't done to be right before God. And it's actually that mindset that drove them to plot to murder Jesus. I mention all that because this is the backdrop by which Jesus then retreats to the lakeside. It's not as if Jesus said, hey, the things are really getting tense. I don't want to get hurt, so I'm going to sneak away to the lakeside. No, it's actually a very strategic move on Jesus' end. The final confrontation, he knew it was coming, but he knew it wasn't the time. And he's not working on the timetable of the Pharisees and what they're doing. He's working on the timetable of God the Father. There was work for him to be done. There was the kingdom to proclaim. There was miraculous things. All these things needed to happen before the crucifixion. And so Jesus, working on the Father's timetable, retreats to the lakeside. And he does so. Crowds of people followed him. That's what Mark says. A great crowd followed. Now look at the location: from Galilee and Judea, Jerusalem and Idumea, and from beyond the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. So geographically, Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, those are all to the west. Idumea is in the south. Transjordan in the east, Tyre and Sidon are in the north. And so here's a clear picture of people coming literally from everywhere to see Jesus. and as far as 100 miles away. You can imagine people traveling on foot, maybe by donkey. For someone then to travel 100 miles away, they had to believe there was something life-altering about the person of Jesus. Jesus had something that they wanted, otherwise they wouldn't have come from everywhere. And we're told the crowds they're dangerously dense, they're massive, they push forward, they crowded. The words that are used here mean to trample violently. So, this is a dangerous scene. The crowds are so thick that they threaten to crush Jesus with their knees. But why were they coming to him? Why were they so urgently making their way to Jesus? Well, I think it's obvious. They wanted physical healing. When you're sick, when you're disabled, when you're hurting, when a loved one has experienced these things, the person is dying, there's really nothing else that you care about, nothing else that consumes your mind than having that situation resolved or alleviated, and so they were coming to Jesus. I think we keep in mind, in every single instance that Jesus healed, it was successful. It was instantaneous, it was complete. So a man who was lame for all of his life, Jesus healed him. All of a sudden, it's as if his legs never had any problem. The man with leprosy, in an instant, Jesus healed them. I imagine his hand was as if he had never, ever had any disablement. And I think when you look closely at the Gospels, you get not a picture of Jesus doing mass healings. What I mean by that, it wasn't if Jesus was just waving his hand and thousands of people were healed at once. No, you actually see him interacting with each person. Jesus wanted to interact with each person he healed. He had a conversation. And so you can just imagine the amount of time it took for Jesus, one by one, face to face, to touch the hurting, the sick, the dying. And so they're pressing around Jesus. They all want Jesus to heal them of whatever it is that they had. Verse 10 captures it, for he had healed so many that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. They just wanted to get their hand on Jesus, believing there would be a benefit. And Jesus, who is a man of sorrows, who's familiar with suffering, was absorbing all the misery like a sponge. I think anyone who professes Christ has to ask the question, what is my motivation in coming to Jesus? The majority of this crowd was unaware of their deepest needs, their true needs, which was the salvation of their souls. More than any physical healing, they needed forgiveness, they needed reconciliation with God, because if you think about it, all these healings, all these miraculous things that Jesus did, in a sense, they were temporary, because there was no promise that the next week you wouldn't get ill, or that the next year you wouldn't have an accident. We're still under the curse of misery, sin, and death. And even though Jesus is compassionate towards the suffering and the pain around him, he still has already made clear in the Gospel of Mark that his priority was preaching the kingdom of God, telling people how to be right with God, telling people how they could have life and how they could know the true God. So in verse 9, because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. And so you can just picture Jesus. He's sitting on this little boat. He goes out into the water. Probably acoustically better for him to be able to preach and tell them about their deepest needs as his voice reverberated off the water and he began to teach them. And yet this crowds tend to follow for selfish reasons. Crowds tend to ask Jesus, what can you do for me? And I think that's the great contrast of the story, because disciples, as we'll see, on the other hand, I think are those who ask, Lord, what must I do to be saved? I want to know you. What must I give up? What must I be willing to leave behind in order to have you? Crowds follow after personal benefits, and yet disciples seek first the kingdom of God and its righteousness. Now, don't get me wrong, not every crowd is bad or terrible, and I'm sure within that crowd there were those who had been healed, and then they were hanging on every word that Jesus spoke, and they wanted to know him. And then when we get to the book of Revelation, we've been reading it at home in our devotions, and there you actually see a crowd. See crowds around the throne, and they're not selfish crowds. They're not crowds just out for what Jesus can give to them, but they're crowds who are singing the praises of God. Multitudes more than anyone could ever count. But I think in these crowds, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that to follow Christ it's challenging, it's arduous, it's full of obstacles, and anyone who would follow Christ has to embrace a life of self-denial. Jesus said, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many, for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and few are those who find it. Some of you may be in the crowd. I mean, you like the idea of what Jesus can do for you. You like the idea of Jesus making life just a little bit easier, maybe more tolerable. You want something from him that might ease the difficulties of this life. But the question is, do you want him? Do you want the Jesus who demands that you turn from your current life in order to follow him? Now, along with all that's happening here by the lakeside come the demonic responses. They're shouting, this is the Son of God. Jesus commands them to be quiet. He doesn't want the demons testifying about him. Their cry is not one of faith, it's a cry of despair. And time doesn't permit us to linger there, but just a summary, what Satan could not do through the Pharisees' rejection of Jesus' claims, he tried to do through the demons' recognition. The demons are actually trying to derail Jesus' ministry. But listen to what one commentator, but both men and demons are to be judged by their fruits. And the fruits of both were obvious and profoundly evil. So that's the scene by the lakeside. And then Jesus moves to a mountaintop. Text doesn't tell us how he got to the mountaintop. He didn't tell us what mountaintop it was. He didn't tell us how long it took him to get from the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee to this mountain. But what we do know is that he called 12 men to go with him. And I think we can just ask 3 basic questions: how he called them, why he called them, and who he called. How did he call them? Well, before this moment, Jesus had already called some. We saw that in the first chapter of Mark, that Jesus, walking along the shore of Galilee, had called some fishermen. He called James, John, Simon, Andrew, and now Jesus is calling more to himself. He goes up a mountain. Now, it's a small detail, but perhaps a significant one, because in the history of redemption, you look throughout the Bible, and some of God's greatest servants received revelation on a mountain. Jesus goes there perhaps to get away from the crowd. In Luke's version, Luke chapter 6, he actually elaborates a little bit more, and he says that when he went up to this mountain, he spent the entire evening in prayer. Now just think about that for a moment. Here's the Son of God, here's God in the flesh, and he finds it necessary, before making an important decision, to spend the entire night conferring with God the Father about those whom he would choose. I mean, the burden was so significant, so great, that he didn't sleep that night. I know I'm guilty of this. But so often, when faced with a decision, instead of taking it to the Lord in prayer, we effectively say, "It's okay, Lord, I got this one. I know exactly what I'm doing." I've come to realize again and again that's actually not a demonstration of strength. That's a demonstration of weakness, spiritual weakness. So Jesus prays, and in verse 13, and he went up on the mountain, he called to him those whom he desired, and they came. It's a deliberate choice on Jesus' part. In that day, when a person would follow someone, it was voluntary. So for example, John the Baptist in his ministry, people heard what he was saying, they liked what they saw, they liked what they heard, and so people would voluntarily say, I'm going to attach myself to this person and follow them. That was sort of the typical pattern in that day, but here it's different. Jesus, no, the honor belongs to him. He summons them, he appoints them, he designates them, he draws them to himself, he chooses them. He reminds them of this later in John 15 in the upper room. He said, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last." But why? Why draw these people to himself? We shouldn't overlook the fact that he chose 12. Every Jew knew, even if they'd kind of flunked out of Torah school, you still knew 12 is a pretty important number. 12 tribes of Israel, and so Jesus undoubtedly is making a symbolic reference to the fact that there's a restoration happening. It's sort of a restoration of the 12 tribes of Israel and Jesus standing as the head. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, he spends 5 chapters talking about Jews and Gentiles together making up the church, and then he refers to them in chapter 6 as the Israel of God. In other words, Jesus is saying, these 12 men, I'm going to use you to sort of establish the kingdom that's going to go throughout the whole entire world. A pretty big task. But notice this, in verse 14, and he appointed 12 so that what? They might be with him. It's really easy to just pass over that phrase, see it as something very simple, read it, move on. But it strikes at the heart of the humanity of Jesus. I mean, we often major on the divinity of Jesus. We say things like, Jesus being part of the Godhead, of course he was never lonely. Of course he didn't need us. And yes, it's true. But Jesus also took on flesh. And Jesus, being fully human, enjoyed and embraced the companionship of his disciples. Humanity never thrives in isolation. He preferred the friendship and the intimacy offered by these 12 men. He loved them. He taught with them. He even grieved over all of their faults because they were with him. Of course, there's another sense in which they needed to be with him. I mean, how would they ever fulfill the mission that he was giving to them if they didn't learn from him, if they didn't follow him and have intimate conversations with him, walk with him, eat with him, suffer with him, and watch how he interacted with people, whether it was rich or poor, young or old, powerful or weak, and hear him preach. And I can just imagine there were moments where Jesus would begin to talk and they fell silent. And Jesus began to explain all these big themes from the Old Testament and how Jesus was fulfilling them and giving them greater understanding. And they couldn't record it on YouTube, so they had to pay attention very carefully and remember these things. And well, what sort of things would you watch if you knew that you were in the presence of God himself? Everything. Every moment. Every word. Every action. Now, years later, in Acts chapter 4, the people were astonished at the power and the wisdom of the disciples. Especially, the text tells us, Luke records it, that people were astonished in light of the fact that these were uneducated men. These were not people who you would think to possess all sorts of knowledge about the scriptures, power, wisdom, might, understanding, and yet they were completely blown away. And you know what Luke records about their reaction? It says they recognized that they had been with Jesus. This is the secret to the power and the wisdom that the disciples had to pursue Christ. And it's not so much a secret because it's right here in the text that they had been with Jesus, that they were in communion with Jesus, that they spent time with Jesus, that they knew Jesus. And the same is true for you and me, that our lives in Christ, for those to be lives well lived, have to be based on communion with Him. And I happen to think that the greatest thing anybody could ever say about us is, that person spends time with Jesus. And you'll notice Jesus also called them not just to be with Him, but to send them out to preach and to have authority to cast out demons. The verb to send out sort of forms the root of the word apostles. Apostle means sent one, and apostle is someone sort of sent out by the king. They're a representative carrying his message, and there's a unique role to the apostles. The author of Hebrews tells us that their preaching was accompanied by signs and wonders. He gave them sort of a unique authority. My understanding of 2 Corinthians 12:12 is that they possessed a unique position in the history of God's kingdom, different than ours. We're not apostles in quite the sense that they are, but the pattern is still the same. Being with Jesus, going out for Jesus. Being with Jesus, telling others about Jesus. And listen, the more you spend with Jesus, the more naturally you'll be able to tell people about Jesus. And then we shouldn't miss the fact of how astounding it is that Jesus called these men. Look, none of them were professional rabbis. None of them had spent, big portion of their early adulthood pursuing theological education or a terminal degree. None of them were famous. None of them were influencers. None of them had a lot of money. I mean, they were not voted most likely to succeed by their peers. They were ordinary people, and in many cases, the people that you would least expect to carry out a worldwide movement. In fact, I'm not sure where I found this, but there's a fictitious memo analyzing the prospects of Jesus' chosen 12. It says, "Dear sir, thank you for submitting the resumes of the 12 men you picked for managerial positions in your new organization. All of them have now taken a series of tests, and we've not only run the results, but we've conducted in-depth interviews with each one by our staff psychologist and vocational aptitude consultant. The profiles of all the tests are included. You'll want to look at them carefully. The staff's opinion is that most of your nominees lack background, education, and vocational aptitude. They do not have the team concept. Simon Peter is emotionally unstable and is given to fits of temper. Andrew has no qualities of leadership. The two brothers, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, place personal interests above company loyalty and are quite boisterous. Thomas demonstrates a questioning attitude that would tend to undermine morale among the ranks. We also must inform you that the Better Business Bureau of Greater Jerusalem has received reports on Matthew questioning his business practices. James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus both have radical leanings and register high scores on the manic depressive scale. However, one of your candidates shows excellent potential. He's a man of ability, resourcefulness, meets people well, has a keen business mind and contacts in high places. He's highly motivated, ambitious, responsible, and unafraid to take initiative. We recommend Judas Iscariot as your controller and right-hand man." Sincerely, the Jerusalem Management Consulting Firm. We could elaborate on each one of those, but it just highlights the fact that none of them were actually sufficient in and of themselves. But when you look at church history, you see that not only did God use them, but most of them died as martyrs. Eusebius, the church historian, records that Peter was made to watch his wife's crucifixion before his own crucifixion, which was upside down because he didn't feel worthy to die in the same way that Christ did. Peter's brother Andrew exhorted people to trust Christ while he was being crucified. James was ordered to die by Herod Agrippa in Acts 12. Philip was martyred after James. Matthew, as tradition has it, was burnt at the stake. Thomas, again, as tradition has it, likely thrust with a spear. You could go on and on, except for Judas, of course, who betrayed Jesus. But this is the core team that Jesus chose. And so if you have a thought for 1 second that I'm an unlikely person to be a disciple of Jesus, I bring nothing to the table, there's nothing that I can do for, yes, I've received Jesus, but there's nothing that I can do for him, and I'm lacking in abilities and talents, and how could I ever tell people? Then you only have to look at the people that Jesus chose, and you realize he used the most unlikely people to do the greatest of things because it was all in his power. Then again, we go back to the greater question is, are you in the crowd or the called? Because your life for all eternity hinges on the choice between the two. The crowd sees Jesus merely as a means to an end, yet the group that Jesus drew to himself realized that Jesus was the end. He called these disciples not to get this or that from him. He called them so that they might be with him. Perhaps a more probing question is your desire to be with Jesus. One thing I've asked of the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and inquire in his temple. Psalm 27:4. It is far better to be among the called than it is the crowd. Following Christ isn't easy for some. It means suffering. It means a death you wouldn't choose. But it also means true and lasting joy, fulfillment. And to move from the crowd to the called is actually quite simple. There's nothing on your end to achieve. There's nothing on your end to earn. It's actually to simply look upon the great sacrifice that God has given to us in Jesus Christ, who died in your place, and to take all of your dependence and to transfer it from yourself and onto the finished work of Christ for you. Amen. And you do that, and you'll move from the crowd to the called, from death and to life.